Morning from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today for this Freedom House event on risks, prospects, and paths forward for freedom in Iran. I'm Jamie Fly. I'm the CEO at Freedom House. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, Freedom House is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing and defending freedom around the world. Since our founding nearly 85 years ago in 1941, Freedom House has worked to support those on the front lines of the struggle for freedom. Through our research and analysis, including our flagship reports like Freedom in the World, which comes out later this week on Thursday, March 19th, we track global trends and we sound the alarm when democratic institutions and human rights come under threat. At Freedom House, we work with policymakers across the political spectrum to strengthen democratic leadership and responses to authoritarianism, and we provide life-saving assistance to courageous activists, journalists, civil society leaders who are defending fundamental freedoms in some of the world's most repressive environments. Today, we're going to focus on the situation in Iran. For nearly half a century, the Iranian regime has carried out a sustained campaign of repression against its own people, using mass arrests, torture, executions, and violent crackdowns on peaceful protests to silence dissent and maintain power. Throughout that period, Freedom House has been documenting the regime's abuses and supporting those on the front lines of freedom advocating for a different Iran. At this uncertain and consequential moment in Iran's history, it's essential that voices and aspirations of the Iranian people remain at the center of the conversation. And so if there's one takeaway from today's event that we at Freedom House hope you walk away with, is that Iran's future must ultimately be determined by the Iranian people. Today's conversation will explore what this moment means for the prospect of freedom in Iran and what governments, civil society, and the international community can do to support the Iranian people in their pursuit of a freer and more democratic future. We're fortunate to be joined by an outstanding group of experts and advocates who bring deep knowledge and experience on these issues. We're going to get the conversation started with some opening remarks by actor and human rights activist Nazanin Boniadi, and then we'll move to a moderated panel discussion led by my friend Jeff Gedman. We will save ample time for questions from the audience after the initial discussion, and you can feel free to submit those questions using the Zoom Q&A function, and Jeff will do his best to get to as many as possible. So with that, I'm going to now introduce Nazanin. Nazanin is an Iranian-born Screen Actors Guild and award-nominated actor and a prominent human rights advocate. Her television and film credits include The Lord of the Rings, Homeland, Counterpart, How I Met Your Mother, and Hotel Mumbai. And Nazanin is one of the foremost advocates for freedom in Iran, for women and girls, and for those unjustly imprisoned by the Iranian regime. Nazanin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Freedom House, for convening this very important discussion today. Across Iran, people are living with realities that are extremely difficult for outsiders to fully grasp. War is crashing into their cities, yet for many Iranians, the fear and grief of this moment are the culmination of nearly half a century of repression, ideological adventurism, nuclear brinkmanship, and corruption by their own government. To understand the reactions in Iran today, we must begin with that history. A dissident inside Iran who reached me recently through a rare satellite connection tried to explain what this moment feels like from within the country. She said, "War is harsh and bitter. When you see smoke rising from the cities and streets of your own country, it fills you with grief. This was never supposed to be our fate. But the government that rules us left no other path." Then she added something that captures the dual reality many Iranians are navigating today. "My children are afraid of the bombs," she said. "But I am afraid for their future if this regime survives." These two fears exist simultaneously. Outside observers sometimes interpret the public mood inside Iran as contradictory. Some abroad were shocked to see expressions of celebration when prominent figures in the regime's security apparatus were killed. But for most Iranians, those individuals are not abstract political actors. They are the architects of decades of repression, responsible for immense suffering and loss. For every innocent life taken, there is a family still seeking justice that has never arrived. For those inside Iran or those who've fled its repression, the moral calculus of survival looks very different. After years documenting abuses, appealing to international institutions, and pleading for accountability with little consequence for perpetrators, the meaning of justice itself can begin to shift in ways outsiders struggle to understand. This moment also exposes a deeper structural tension in the international system. International law, as many legal scholars have pointed out, and as my friends in the panel of experts today will likely discuss, is built around the principle of state sovereignty. The prohibition on the use of force, except in self-defense or with authorization from the UN Security Council, was designed to prevent wars between states and protect weaker countries from aggression. But that framework struggles when a government itself becomes the primary threat to its own population. The Iranian people have lived inside that dilemma for decades, all while their regime has committed countless crimes against humanity and breached international law. During the nationwide uprising earlier this year, human rights monitors documented more than 6,500 killings as security forces opened fire on protesters across the country. Credible estimates suggest the true death toll could exceed 30,000. Tens of thousands more were arrested. At the height of the violence, authorities imposed a nationwide communications blackout, severing the Iranian people from the outside world, essentially concealing their crimes and obstructing justice. In theory, sovereignty should not shield mass atrocities. In practice, the international community's tools often prove too slow, too limited, or potentially constrained to protect those living under such regimes. This is not only a human rights crisis, it's also a geopolitical one. The future of Iran will shape the future of the region and carry consequences far beyond it. If the current regime survives intact, the outcomes are not difficult to foresee. Intensified repression at home, continued regional aggression, renewed nuclear brinkmanship, the likelihood of a refugee crisis, and instability that will ripple far beyond Iran's borders. But the alternative future is profoundly different. An Iran governed by institutions that are representative of its people and accountable to them would transform not only the lives of its citizens, but Iran's relationship with the world. A democratic Iran would be far more likely to act as a constructive regional neighbor and a cooperative member of the international community, rather than a source of perpetual confrontation. In other words, the question before us is not simply about the cessation of foreign firepower, it's also about ending the war the Islamic Republic has waged against the Iranian people for 47 years. That's why, from a humanitarian perspective, the words "no to war" ring hollow if they aren't also accompanied with the words "free Iran." And that's why the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran said today in Geneva that the Iranian people's right to self-determination must remain at the core of any solution. Lasting peace and stability in Iran and across the Middle East will depend on whether the Iranian people are empowered to establish a government that reflects their will and answers to them. That aspiration has driven decades of struggle inside Iran. It continues today, often at enormous personal risk. The voices we should be listening to most closely are those coming from inside the country. If sovereignty continues to protect regimes more effectively than it protects citizens, the promise of human rights will be insincere. But if the world can close this gap, aligning the defense of sovereignty with the defense of human life, then Iran's tragedy may yet become a turning point for the international order. Until then, many Iranians live with a harsh paradox, hoping this intervention may end almost half a century of tyranny, while fearing that they will be left to face a more vengeful regime and a country in ruins. Thank you.
So thank you, Nazanin. That was an eloquent and powerful statement. And Jamie, thank you for your framing remarks. Thanks to the team at Freedom House, and in advance to audience and panelists. 30 minutes ago, we had well north of 200 people joining us this morning, today. mostly people with deep knowledge and expertise. We want to hear from you before the time is out today. It is, as you've heard, a tremendous moment of opportunity. It's an intense moment of grave uncertainty, and I appreciated both Jamie and Nazanin putting the Iranian people at the center of this conversation, their hopes, their voices, their aspiration. We have three extraordinary speakers today. We'll have a conversation, open it up to you all. I'm not going to give long introductions because you know them all and because we want to save time for them to speak and for the discussion. They all have deep knowledge of history, of law and human rights, of advocacy, and deepest connection and intimacy to the people of Iran. And if I may add, they're all committed for years now to responsible political change, ending tyranny, and a transition to decent, accountable government. With that from me, Ladan, may I call on you first? Would you give us a snapshot? It's multifaceted and it's a bit complicated, but a snapshot of where we are as we enter week 3 of the Israeli-US operation. And then, if you would, a word about the political opposition inside, outside the country, as there's waiting, planning, and preparation. Ladan?
Yes, good morning, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I just wanted to say that what our center, Abdurrahman Borman Center for Human Rights, has gleaned out of its contacts within Iran confirms what Nazanin said about the combination and of worries and hope with regard to the war. Now, regarding the political activism right now inside Iran, of course, everyone is in jail. With the internet shutdown, communications are completely perturbed. So we don't hear much from leaders on the ground, basically. And the weight of this responsibility has been transferred to the diaspora. And in diaspora, we have multiple groups and organizations, but the most important one right now is, of course, the one led by Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who has a project, who has been called upon by the demonstrators inside Iran, and who is also getting more and more adhesion within the diaspora. So the Crown Prince is mentioning he wants to be the leader of the transition to a secular democracy in Iran. His project, of course, must be analyzed, but in his project, he will lead in a sort of, he controlled the complete 3 powers, legislative, executive, and judicial for 2-3 years, until an elective government is replacing it. Next to this, we see more Republican forces trying to coalesce and organize. We don't know if they will, what will come out of it. It's very new. So the war has really dynamized the diaspora and probably the opposition within the country, but we can't yet see the main feature assessing their project and competing with each other. So the state of confusion is prevalent everywhere right now. And we have the main opposition force is the monarchist one right now.
Ladan, thank you. I wanted to turn to you, Holly. We heard from Nazanin that the situation inside Iran links very quickly to geopolitics as well. I noted you commenting, I think 3-4 days ago, on the miscalculation, I think it was your view, miscalculation of Iran in attacking neighbors. Could you comment on that and say where we are in terms of the relationship to neighbors and what Iranian goals are, the regime's goals are?
Sure. First, thank you, Freedom House, for having me today with such an extraordinary panel of Iranian women that I look up to. I would start with I'm going to go back to 2023 when Oman and China brokered a peace deal or recommencement of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So in 2016, the missions in Tehran and Mashhad were stormed and ties ceased between the two countries. And so after many years, these ties had recommenced. And afterwards, we saw a lot of the Arab states in the Persian Gulf follow suit and start to recommence ties with Tehran. And so I think there was this impression that Arab states in the Persian Gulf needed to take their matters into their own hands because they had realized that after the 2019 Aramco attacks in Saudi Arabia, that the United States wasn't going to actually defend them. And so that was why there was this rapprochement with Tehran over the years. And so I think there was this assumption, I think, from countries, especially like Saudi Arabia, that had spent so much time developing this relationship with Tehran in recent years that maybe they wouldn't have what we see play out in the past 3 weeks. And so I just want to unpack kind of what Tehran's strategy seems to be. It's been dubbed Operation Madman. And basically, I think that their assumption was threefold. First, that they would attack much of the countries in the region, including these Arab states that they've worked to improve ties with, on the assumption that they would call for a ceasefire and that they would call the President Donald Trump and say, we need to end this war. And so we've seen them fire ballistic missiles and drones across the region. Second, I think there was this assumption that if American soldiers would be killed, that the president would also think twice about this war and be worried that the optics of it and there would be pushback from the American people. And third, it's much more complex, is this worry about oil prices. We've seen that the Strait of Hormuz has been blocked, and there's been this real concern about the oil prices. The president has, of course, doubled down so far. He's been calling on U.S. allies to help defend the Strait of Hormuz. But at this juncture, it seems to be so far a U.S.-led initiative. And I think it was a strategy that they assumed that eventually the president would cut and run because he'd be worried about this turning into a so-called forever war or going against the MAGA movement, which believes in America first. And of course, a war like this runs counter to what the MAGA movement views. And so I think that was the strategy of Tehran. And so far, I think it hasn't been working because the president has doubled down. But of course, that can change very quickly in the days and if not weeks to come. And I say weeks because my understanding from the Israeli government and U.S. government is that this is going to be a weeks-long operation. But of course, I think if the dynamics on the ground or regionally speaking were to change, I think you would see a different response.
Ali, thank you. Let me turn to Gizu and get you into the conversation. I was going to ask you broadly, even if it's so that this now and ultimately has to be driven by the people of Iran, inside Iran, what external actors and organizations like Freedom House can do, but it also links to a question you have in chat now. Do people inside the country need help with internet connectivity? One of the attendees asks, if so, what can be done? What can we do? Kisu?
Thank you for that question. I'll note that there are some experts who are working on this issue very deeply. I am linked into a coalition that works on it, but I would never claim to be the expert on that. Masa Ali Mardani at Witness is leading this with colleagues. And the latest is that, there's a lot of discussion around getting Starlink terminals into the country. That's obviously a clunkier affair in terms of needing to bring equipment into the country. Also, different activists being targeted once it's understood that they are using Starlink. The more durable but more long-term solution is what is called direct to cell. And so it's this idea that anyone with a smartphone built after a certain time would be able to link into satellites that are operating overhead in the skies, and they would be able to get internet connectivity as a result of that. There's quite a lot that is happening that I think we hope to be able to share publicly at some point. I'll just give some of the broad strokes of it, which is that there are some important meetings that are being held with the ITU, which is a sort of UN-connected body that deals with telecoms. And it's very much around whether certain, not to get too technical, but whether some spectrum ranges will be allowed to be able to enable this internet connectivity. So what we're really seeing here is that there'll be a new model of iPhone that will come out that will allow anybody to be able to connect to these frequencies. There's a limited amount of these frequencies to go around. And not to get too much into the weeds, but basically this would allow people who have that model of smartphone to really even circumvent the need for local carriers to agree to this. So the challenge when you look at something like Iran versus a situation of Ukraine, for example, is that when there was the attempt to have direct to cell with Ukraine, Ukrainian local carriers obviously have no objection to that. Whereas for Iran, as you might imagine, the carriers that are under the control of the Islamic Republic are not going to agree to internet being available to everybody. They've specifically cut it off for that reason. For anybody in the audience who doesn't know, we've been dealing with the total internet shutdown really since January, but there was a brief break. And then when the military strikes from the US and Israel began on February 28th, right back to the regime shutting this off. And we've seen that different Islamic Republic of officials who've been going on global media have been getting direct questions about whether and why they are able to connect via video link to these interviewers, whereas the rest of the population has no access. So those are the sort of long-term solutions. There will be some advocacy that's required for all the countries that are decision makers with the ITU and also decision makers with these online coalitions that are dealing with freedom of information, freedom of internet, freedom of access. And so I think there will be more specific action items for those countries to really look at the larger framework that surrounds this connectivity issue. But for sure, that is one of the top issues because, as has been noted by the panelists, we don't actually, it's very difficult to understand how Iranians in Iran are perceiving of the events because they're not able to come online and freely tell us. So it's really shared through phone calls and then through a lot of people comparing their networks and explaining what their family and friends and those that they can connect to in limited ways are sharing.
Thank you. Gizu, I want to return, thank you for that. I want to return to you, Lalan, for a moment, if I may. This is something that Holly alluded to. Do we have in due course a problem of time? This is my sharpening of the formulation, my words. That is gas prices, pressure from voters, and an early expectation that this would be, in many circles, a short and, so to speak, cleaner war. Now, as we've already heard from Holly, this may be an operation of weeks, maybe even longer. Do you have concern about the pace of politics right now as it competes with military and political objectives in Iran?
Yes, I do. And I wanted to mention regarding your first question, I forgot to mention the Kurdish forces who also are organizing as a third force of anti-regime that are being activated on the frontiers and borders of Iran. Regarding the change of the pace of the war, I'm very worried because for 47 years, the Islamic Republic has waged an unconventional war against the West in general and the United States and Israel in particular. And because they are not militarily predominant, they always try to shift this war on the narrative battleground. And as the war is taking longer and longer, they will succeed in mobilizing within the West the public opinion. And as you said, with the climbing of the gas price, it would be easier for them and change the narrative about the war. And this is where I think pro-democracy forces within liberal democracies have a crucial role to play and to be aware of. And I think that's where, internal political issues will be used by different stakeholders within these democracies. Here, for instance, the fight between Democrats and Republicans, the war will be used as an internal matter and will lose its real subject, which is the survival of a terrorist regime inside Iran. And this is where both institutions like Freedom House or pro-human rights organizations and forces needs to be very intelligent and, make sure that this is the Islamic Republic doesn't win this battle of narrative inside these democracies.
So, Ladan, before I go back to Holly and Gizu, I have a follow-up question. How does one advance the argument in Washington that degrading and dismantling the military capacity is extremely important? I will say ending the Islamic Republic essential, but not sufficient. That I'm suggesting we need a broader vision for what happens next. Could you speak to that?
Yes, I think that's very important because this war that the Islamic Republic is waging against the West is an ideological war. And this ideological war will not be won by bombs. Although the regime may be weakened, and in June attack, its arsenal and military capacity were really weakened, but the America and Israel were forced to do it again right in February. So the issue is that we need to bring about the circumstances. The only army that can win the ideological war is that of the Iranian people, by defeating this regime and showing that it has been an evil and nobody wants it inside Iran. This will be the ultimate victory, both for democracy and for the Iranian people. So we need to organize, to be inventive, and to help the Iranian people win this battle. And I think that's where, if I were a Democrat here, I would hold accountable the administration by saying, what is your plan? How much connection you have had with Iranian forces for democracy? How Iran's future is viewed from the standpoint of the administration? What are the forces that are present? How we can help strengthen pro-democracy forces? These are the questions that should become the mainstream questions of the democratic criticism of the Republican war. Instead of attacking, just say, stop the war, come out, negotiate with these criminals, and postpone what will necessarily come about again, postpone it for another 5 years. I think that would be the wrong solution and the right solution, but they need to get out of their ideological comfort zone. They need to think. Without thinking in politics, you don't go anywhere. And I think you repeat the same issues.
Ladan, thank you. I'm going to turn to Holly and Gizu. There's a question in chat that has to do with, I think, ideological comfort zone. Someone who is unnamed asked the question, can you help, my paraphrasing, by the way, can you help us sort the problem on the political left in the United States, across Europe, where there's openness to expressing solidarity with the long-suffering people of Iran, but what about Gaza, and are there not contradictions and hypocrisies? But I'm going to add another, Holly and Gizu. To sort objections right now, could you share with us your advice to the American president now on how we clarify objectives both in the military operation and what comes after? That's a lot, but Holly, you first.
Well, I think Ladan laid out some of this already, but I think the real issue we're having is understanding the military objectives versus the strategy. We have a sense that the military objectives are related to security, the military in terms of taking out the ballistic missiles, but what's the strategy? Initially, assets were moved to the region in January because of an unprecedented massacre of Iranians. And then we initially heard from the president and also from Israel that this was about regime change. And now there's been a walking back of that narrative. And it seems that the president was hoping for a Venezuela-like deal where he would make a deal with somebody from the current regime, and that hasn't been panning out. And I think that seemed to have caught him by surprise. And he said he was surprised that they haven't capitulated. But for all of us here on this panel, we understand that this is an ideological regime. And if anything, they would rather, unfortunately, that the country burn than actually give in to the United States, especially after the killing of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And so there's that. But I think what worries me is that as an Iran analyst here at a DC think tank, none of us have been consulted. At least with the 2003 Iraq War, there was some thinking involved into the future of Iraq. There was something called the Future of Iraq project, where at least 100 Iraqis were consulted from various backgrounds. None of that has happened, and I think we can all agree here that democracy doesn't come through bombs. And so I personally, and I think most of the people, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I assume that we all worry what would happen to the Iranian people if this regime were to survive. And so far, it is surviving. And so I worry that they're going to take revenge on the Iranian people. We had at least 2,100 executions last year, according to the Borman Center. That was the highest since the 1980s. And we were already on track to that number, if not higher. I believe it was 552 between January to the war. And so there's an unprecedented security presence in the streets during this war. There have been many threats made against dissent. One official went on television to say that they would make sure that their mothers mourn them. And so that to me signals that what would come out of this would be so much more brutal than before the war. And I worry about that. And I don't think that the US government has really thought about that at all. And it's very worrisome for me.
Holly, thank you. Kiso, feel very free and encouraged to comment on what you've just heard. I'm also going to take the advantage of moving us along a little bit. We had two questions in chat. One, the name has disappeared from my screen, forgive me, but theories of change in reference to the great and late Peter Ackerman. And then coupled with that is Josh Moravchik on, we haven't seen early collapse. What are the prospects for fissures and division inside the regime or armed opposition internally? Kisu?
I'm so sorry. I was almost kicked out of this room. So I caught maybe half your question, but I think it was about the internal divisions in the regime and a reflection on that.
Yeah, and the prospects internally per Josh Moravchik on how we hasten a proper demise of the regime. Are there fissions? Are there divisions at the regime level? Is there the prospect of armed opposition internally?
Yeah. So maybe it's helpful to zoom out a little bit because I know that the question before this was really about what the US, what the US president should be doing, what the US government should be doing. And this has been a long trajectory where a series of decisions were made along the journey, which is why we are now in the place that we are in today. There was a comment about the left, I think, in the US, but that could also apply to the global left. The reality is that there was an opportunity, at least in my view, others might disagree, but there was an opportunity for the world to come together, delegitimize the regime that is in Iran, ensure that there were boycotts, that there was not financial engagement with that regime. And a lot of that would need to be driven by countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, places that have not engaged in, unilateral or even sometimes the multilateral sanctions, and who generally have been resistant and have sometimes politically aligned with the Islamic Republic. There was an opening during the Woman Life Freedom movement in 2022. We saw that for a lot of countries that typically had been somewhat sympathetic to the Islamic Republic, that for them it then became unconscionable to support a regime that was brutalizing women and children. The very grassroots nature of that movement, the fact that there was such a focus on women's rights, and that for a lot of those countries who might be ideologically in line with populist movements or in sort of anti-capitalist ways of thinking, for them, the brutalization of women is not part of that. So when you see a lot of these regimes that might, and dictatorships that might have a certain economic vision of the world that is at odds with the US, for example, their treatment of women, minorities, and so on is not necessarily so, right? And so I think that made the Islamic Republic really an outlier. And so there was a moment where there could have been more of a capturing of the world's attention, similar but not the same as what happened in delegitimizing the apartheid regime in South Africa, which really took a lot of external pressure, but also relied on a lot of important internal factors. So I think that a key moment was missed, and there's a range of reasons for that, including the inability of the opposition to present a united front on Iran. Also, the events of October 7th have obviously taken global politics in a very different direction. And so the issues around Iran now are very polarized. But in that instance, had there been a very significant divestment from the Islamic Republic's economy, like let's not forget the UAE, for example, is one of the reasons that the Islamic Republic has been able to endure because of all the amounts of all the money that flows through there, essentially, including of people who are within that regime apparatus. And that's not something that's discussed often in DC, given the UAE's influence. Had those nodes really been properly targeted in the right way, I think that we would have seen defections. That's my personal view, that we would have seen defections from that regime once it was no longer monetarily prosperous for them. We're now in a very different place where there's kinetic action, where there's discussion of whether, as you were asking, whether different opposition factions should be armed. These are all conversations that, in my view, could have gone in a different direction several years back. We find ourselves to be in the place that we are today. I think what we're not seeing are significant defections just yet. It doesn't mean that it won't happen. We do see that at least diplomats who are overseas, IR diplomats, are claiming asylum. So that's a good initial sign. There are promises from the son of the deposed Shah, Reza Pahlavi, that there are a number, numbers in the thousands of defectors and that they will be activated when the time comes. I think we're just going to have to wait and see if that happens. But there should be more thinking around what are the off-ramps for people within this regime apparatus. I don't think we should just accept that somehow they're resilient, that nothing is going to change. I see a lot of global media reporting saying, look at this regime, they're so resilient, nothing's going to crack them. That's always true until it isn't. And there's always a price for a lot of these individuals. So I think governments around the world should start to really give concrete thought to what that looks like.
Yeah, so could I follow on and ask you to comment on what can be done now to mobilize public and global opinion? We know the ghastly past, but it seems to me people ought to be able to focus on the horrid present: detainees, political prisoners, very large numbers, even prison and jeopardy as we speak. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, two things. One is specific to the Iran context, which is really that there was a sort of mass atrocity denial that I think a lot of us were witnessing after the events of January 8th and 9th. So the massacre that happened, we don't have exact numbers still. At the low end, it's at the very least 10,000 killed in the space of 2 days. And that's a conservative estimate. For sure, the numbers in the double-digit thousands, some of the estimates and leaks from senior officials and things like that suggest that it could be upwards to 30,000. The point is that that is one of the worst single day global massacres on record. So it's not just one of the worst massacres for Iran. That's even besides the point. Globally, it's one of the worst. And I don't think that the gravity of that has been fully understood. The fact that when you average out the kills, um, it is the same as if you average out the kill rate during the Rwandan genocide in the 90s, which obviously invited a serious reflection on why the world didn't take action in concrete ways to make sure that that genocide didn't happen. And of note, a lot of all of that killing wasn't actually through bombs, which can kill people at scale and in large numbers. This was from individualized killing with guns, machine guns, machete. So very brutal and personal way of killing thousands and thousands of people. Unfortunately, there was a lot of atrocity denial in many corners. There was sarcasm about the number of individuals killed. There was dismissiveness. There was comparisons to the number of killed in Gaza, which is completely irrelevant. It is as relevant as the number of killed in Sudan would be, or the number of killed in DRC would be, or the number of killed in Yemen would be. It's 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 just in the pantheon of mass atrocities, but it did become very politicized. And I find that incredibly regrettable because each one of these people that were killed are a life. They represent a universe in and of their own. And I think that somewhere along the way that was lost. Also because there wasn't the ability, obviously, Iranians were shut off from the internet during that time. And so they also couldn't properly communicate their stories. We are getting a lot of that information now. And so and in the weeks when the internet was turned back on, or the days rather, so I would also urge that we not lose what happened there and ensure that there's robust accountability processes and measures that go to dealing with that massacre because it's not old news. I think with the events moving so quickly and now there being armed conflict, there is somewhat of a that part of the story appears to have been lost with the look to the future. So I would urge that we stay focused on that. The other thing I would say is consistency matters. There's been a incredible weakening of our multilateral system over the past year. This has really happened over the past decade, I'd say, beginning with Syria, the complete paralysis of the UN Security Council, then Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and then Israel not applying the laws of war and also militarily striking different countries. I think it was 6 countries in 2025. That lack of consistency around what the international rules-based order is matters when it comes to how public opinion and how global opinion views the deaths of innocents. It shouldn't, but it does. And there's always a discussion of the hypocrisy when one side is claiming that their hurts are not recognized and another side is claiming that their hurts are recognized. There should be no sides. We should ultimately be pro-people, pro-protection of civilian life. We should apply the same standards that we would apply to looking at this conflict as we would any other conflict. There's no inconsistency in recognizing the killing of civilians that's happening in the conflict right now. And all of that we can hold true. So that would be my recommendation, that I think we need to strengthen this international system that for decades has yielded a lot of positives instead of believing that now we're simply in a might is right world and that none of this matters. I think the frameworks do matter. We need to apply it consistently, and we need to not forget what happened with the massacre. There's some discussion of how if we are now discussing the massacre, we're somehow propagating the war. And I think that's so incredibly wrong. It's such a wrong way of thinking. We are speaking for the survivors, for the victims, especially in a time when a brutal regime has cut their internet off and they are not able to be able to give those interviews to the international media like we can, and when we speak to them and transmit their messages.
Thank you. I want to pose the same question to Ladan and Holly. And part one of the question is, how do we focus attention, putting the people of Iran back at the center of the extreme vulnerability now of a population largely unarmed and with so many detained? And then the companion question that comes from my colleague Andres Ilves from Middle East Broadcasting Networks. How does one advocate, as we've heard from some sources abroad, that the Iranian people take destiny into their own hands and rise up when there's so many elements of the regime, well armed, parading the streets, and vicious and cruel? Ladan?
Well, that's a good question. Historically, when Khomeini strengthened his grip over the country, many of its opposition forces turned to armed uprising, from monarchists to communists. And of course, they were crushed because as a group, you cannot compete with a state that is sitting on oil well and has the Soviet Union as its supporter. So that's why slowly the resistance turned into civil disobedience and civil rights activism. But the question is that with Women Life Freedom movement, this movement was crushed, and the massacre of nearly 30,000 people in 2 days in January was also showing that there is no competing forces here, given the armed nature of the state repression. Now, if we are watching the dismantlement, because we are now in the second week of this war, and we know, for instance, that there is an incident I wanted to mention. We have a citizen journalist called Vahid online, who is showing the images, who is very trustworthy and very specific in being accurate. And currently, he is under threat of death by the regime elements because people who are close to the security forces are watching his Telegram channel, which has 1,200,000 members, and realizing that what is fed to them about how the regime is crushing America and Israel and so on is wrong. And this has become an issue for the regime decision makers, because they see that if their security forces watches this kind of information, then they might start thinking that they should defect. There is no hope. So the war again is the war of narrative and the war of truth, and we may see defection. Now, how the population could fight back against this regime if the repressive apparatus is dismantled? There may be possibility of arming the population, but it needs organization, it needs leadership on the ground, and it needs a little bit of military training. I don't know how this can happen quickly. It takes time, and it needs support, basically. Or some of the defectors would turn to support the population. I don't think any of these is not an option. All of these options all of the possibilities are on the table. It depends on how this psychological war goes on, and if the truth starts to demobilize regime elements.
Ladan, thank you. Holly, one question on the table is when and how can the population fight back? And one of our colleagues has posed a question in chat about the role of the Kurds. Could you tackle that in part or whole?
So, just to piggyback on what Ladan was talking about, I think one of the things that the West hasn't done is actually create an off-ramp for defections. They really haven't offered a space for officials, whether they're diplomats in Europe, though we've seen it reportedly four since January, defect. And then inside the country, I think we're going to have to see what it looks like in terms of are they able to feed these security forces? Are they able to pay for pay their salaries? And it's really hard to tell at this juncture. That being said, defections doesn't mean actually publicly saying I'm going to defect. It can mean feigning illness, not showing up at the barracks that day, not actually pulling the trigger on your gun when you're shooting at protesters. So there's very different variations. And that being said, as I noted earlier, there's a high security presence in the streets at this moment. And we just had Quds Day or Jerusalem Day on Friday, which is takes place every last Friday of Ramadan, which is this solidarity with the Palestinian cause protests. And we saw these top Iranian officials actually out on the streets with these pro-regime protesters. And so if I was somebody that's at lower or bottom rung of the security forces and I saw these guys are walking around freely and there's a big security presence, I wouldn't want to defect very publicly at least. So I think that could obviously change in the days and weeks to come, depending on the direction of this war, but I wouldn't ignore it just yet. On the topic of the Kurds, as people that may have watched the war carefully, there was reports that the CIA and Mossad had materially supported Iranian Kurds to actually fight back against the clerical establishment. The Trump administration has at least walked back those comments, at least publicly. But there was a Channel 4 UK report suggesting that there were still Iranian Kurds on the border that were ready to take arms against the IRGC. They are a small population, and I think that sending them to do that would unfortunately result in them being killed. And I don't think it would really benefit Iranian Kurds at this moment when you see that the regime's still very much in power. I think what also worried Iranians was that when these reports came out, that it was suggesting that maybe that these Kurdish groups might be taking arms to carve out their own space, which we've heard hasn't been the case from some of the Kurdish leadership. But that being said, it played into the hands of the Islamic Republic, which has been arguing that the United States and Israel are out to carve up Iran and turn it into Syria, basically. They say the Syriization of Iran, that they want to destroy the country and fragment it, which is ironic given their big role in propping up the Bashar al-Assad regime and actually taking part in repressing the Syrian people in their quest for freedom. So I hope that answers your question.
It's very helpful. Holly, we're approaching the end, you all, and thank everybody who's participated. Holly, someone commented internally a couple minutes ago that it seems both internally in Iran and externally, women have played an extraordinary role in vision, values, advocacy, and intellectual heft. Thoughts on that, but really thoughts on the way forward, how this can be mobilized and developed further.
Sure. Well, I think Iranian women have always been at the forefront. We've seen it since the late 18th century when there was a tobacco protest, and it was led by a harem of Iranian women under the Qajar era. And we've seen these women, we call them in Persian, shirzan or lionesses, lead so much over the decades. We also saw it during the 79 revolution on International Women's Day. They actually took to the streets to protest when news was apparent that hijab was going to be mandatory in Iran. And of course, most famously for those that have been tracking Iran in recent years, that came to head in 2022 with the Women Life Freedom Uprising. I think Iranian women will and always will be at the forefront of this fight because they have borne the brunt of this repression for the past 47 years. The Islamic Republic has waged a war first and foremost on them. And so I think that, we've seen these protests in recent weeks. It's been a younger cohort of Iranian women. I focus on Gen Z a lot, and it has been Iranian Gen Z women that have been leading these protests in recent years. So I don't think that's going to be changing in the near future. And so I really think we should be putting our faith and hope into Iranian women, especially their youth.
Holly, thank you. As we wrap up, I wanted to give each of our distinguished speakers an opportunity to share a final thought and move us forward a little bit. This has been a great discussion, uh, filled with realism and intelligence, also passion and hope and aspiration. Gizu, what should we walk away with today?
Just that violence comes in many forms. I think that I've received more concerned messages about the well-being of my family and friends in Iran in the past 2 weeks. I've received a lot from non-Iranians, and many of them, and I do not blame them, did not reach out in January after a massacre that killed tens of thousands of people. And I think that as a globe, we struggle with the idea of what happens when a regime is killing and brutalizing people within its borders versus when another country launches military strikes and attacks the sovereignty of another country. Somehow, when there's a question around sovereignty, that becomes, and war crimes, that's something that sort of eclipses in the global imagination what crimes against humanity are, which can happen in peacetime. They don't have to happen in the context of an armed conflict, but they can be just if just as and if not more devastating.
Could I ask a follow-on quickly? Europe broadly has been reluctant to support the U.S.-Israeli military operations, yet Europe at least gives voice in principle to human rights and rule of law and democracy. Are there ways in which Europeans can step up and lean in and complement what's happening on the ground militarily?
There are so many things that countries could be doing right now that have nothing to do with military action. There are multiple accountability processes that have not been followed up on. Multiple European countries like Germany, Sweden, France, and also Canada can launch structural investigations which look into the crimes against humanity committed by the Islamic Republic. There are assets of the Islamic Republic officials that are outside. We have just read investigative reporting about Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, having multi-million pound homes in North London and in the UK and getting medical treatment in the UK. None of these countries have taken the strong measures that they need to look into freezing these assets, seizing these assets, repatriating them for a future-free Iran, or having them benefit Iran human rights, those who are impacted by human rights violations in Iran. So there's so much that can happen that does not involve endorsing military strikes. And regrettably, that hasn't happened to this moment, which is why we are in the quagmire, I'd say, that we're in. And so I'm really hoping for the best for the Iranian people, because I'm sure all the panelists agree, the messages that we get from Iran are heartbreaking. They are saying, many are saying, we fear if the bombs stop, because it might mean that the regime is then not uprooted and not dislodged. And that is a horrific thing to hear, that anybody would be wishing for that. But that's the place we find ourselves in. So I hope it's a cautionary tale for other communities that are looking to transition from dictatorship to democracy, and what the world should do, and not kick the can down the road because they'd rather preserve the status quo and preserve shipping in the strait and all the rest of it.
So thank you. Holly, your final thought and takeaway from the conversation today?
Well, I think that the most important thing is not to forget the Iranian people when the bombs inevitably do stop. And I think that fortunately the news cycle tends to move on quickly. And from what we've all been saying, including Gisu's last note about this worry about what comes next for the Iranian people, that needs to be focused on more. because there is a real worry that we're going to see repression not seen before in the past 47 years, because this is a wounded lion and it's going to focus inward. It had this unprecedented massacre in January, which showed that it had crossed a threshold of no return, and it was capable of yet again committing mass atrocities against its people that rise to the level of crimes against humanity. And so I think we need to remember the Iranian people in this moment and in the foreseeable future, because unfortunately they will be forgotten once this new cycle ends.
Holly, thank you. Ladan, a final word.
Yes, I think I second what Gisu and Holly said, but I think that Europe can do much more. Europe has a treasure of experience in transition to democracies since Portugal and Spain. And I think they should step forward and be much more proactive in engaging the opposition, in checking their programs, in making sure these are democratic, in bringing them together. One of the experiences that we could learn from is the transition after the Second World War in France, with de Gaulle, with the Free France, then the government in the National Council, and then the provisional government. We need constitutional experts to help us come up with a much better transition program. And this, Europe can do it. It can provide the platform. It can provide expertise. It can pressure forces of the diaspora to sit together and work together and make sure that what they have and their vision is democratic. Liberal principles are universal. Human rights is universal. Women, when on March 8, 1979, came into the streets of Iran, they shouted, "Freedom is neither Western nor Eastern. Freedom is global, and we should work together. We need it. It is an ideological battle. We need the support of those pro-democracy forces globally." And I think Europe can do a much better work, not only not to compromising with the regime, but also to proactively help us come up with a really strong transitional program that will be inclusive, pluralistic, and forward-looking for a liberal democracy in Iran.
Ladan, thank you very much. Thank everybody who joined today and contributed today and followed the conversation today. Ladan, Holly, and Gizu will continue to watch you, listen to you, read you, and learn from you. This was a superb, sobering, and hopeful and heartening conversation. Thanks to Jamie Fly and the team at Freedom House. Thanks everybody who joined, and more to follow.